Hey, welcome to my little studio. Thank you for clicking the video. In a minute we're going to crack on, we're going to paint this piece. Just wanted to say, I've never done a video like this before. I'm only an amateur artist, and if you find any of it useful, any tip or trick you pick up, if you could just leave me a like and hit that subscribe button, it would mean the absolute world to me. So thank you, and yeah, let's crack on. So this piece is 21 by 14 inches and it's on stretch linen. I always like to pre-tone my camsid and linen with a light wash of raw sienna, and that is because white is the highest value I can achieve, and now I want to save that brightest of whites to the very end for when I'm doing my last highlights. So I won't be using any pure titanium white until the very end. In fact, it looks like I'm using pure white now, but it's actually a mix of titanium white, a little bit of French ultramarine, and a tiny bit of burnt sienna. Also, whilst I'm just blocking in these sky colours, a little bit about the inspiration for this piece. I recently stayed in one of these cabins in Thorpe Forest in Norfolk in the UK, and the way the light just hit these cabins at sunset and at sunrise was so inspiring. I just loved how the evening light faded and the light from these cabins just illuminated everything around it, and I knew as soon as I saw it I had to paint it. It had to be painted. So even though I'm not sponsored by anybody, I will leave a link to the company I stay with in the description in case you were looking for a cabin getaway in the UK. Okay, back to the painting. I normally work in 3 stages: the blocking in stage, the modelling stage, and the detailing stage. What you're seeing here is the blocking in stage, and this is basically getting the colours down, getting everything in its place and not worrying too much about the detail. The detail comes later on. And I'm also holding back on my values, so I'm saving my darkest darks and my lightest lights to the very end, at least till we get to the end of the modelling stage and beginning of the detail stage. So far for my sky colours I've used cadmium yellow, cadmium orange, titanium white, French ultramarine, and remember that white is not pure white, so it had a little bit of burnt sienna and French ultramarine in it. And then I got my fan brush and blended them all together. And for the forest floor I'm using a bit of Verdinian hue, permanent green light with a little bit of French ultramarine blue, and then as the foreground gets closer I'm using more of a darker green, and that's a mixture of the Verdinian hue and a little bit of raw umber mixed in as well, just at the foreground so I can create that depth. As you can see, we've moved on to blocking in the cabin. I'm not too worried about the detail at this stage. Like I said, we're just literally getting the colours down. So I'm using raw umber, burnt sienna, French ultramarine, and then for the highlights on the roof at the top where the last bit of sunlight is hitting the roof, I'm using the yellow ochre and titanium white. So if you've seen my work before, you'll know that light is the most important thing for me to capture, and I love telling stories through that light. Now on this cabin I have 2 sources of light, one by the main porch and the front door, which we haven't done yet, which we get to in a minute, and then we've also got this one on the side of the building. This will be where in the detailing stage I use my pure titanium white, and because I've been holding back on my value, that last bit of pure white I put on will really stand out. Oh, and also what I'll do is I'll put the 2 reference photos that I am basing this piece around on the screen right now for you, so you can see what I'm working from. And if you're interested to know what kind of paint brand I'm using, I am using Winsor & Newton. I always use Winsor & Newton for my oil paints. And for my medium, I always use Liquin Original until the very end. And in the very end, I will probably use Liquin Impasto. And that is for the thickening up the paint, just for those last highlights. As you can see, we've moved on to the little porch area now, and that main light source is going to be lighting up this staircase. So what I'm really focusing on here is keeping my shadows, the little shadows underneath the step, really light. So it's just basically a little bit of raw sienna and a tiny bit of raw umber. Okay, we're on to the last bit of the blocking in stage now, which is very exciting because that means we move on to my favourite stage, which is the modelling stage. But these are pine trees I'm putting in here, so I'm just basically doing the trunks of the trees. Just want to get the main outline down, and I'm using raw umber. That is all I'm using for this, just raw umber, because eventually we're going to go back over it and we're going to make it darker, and we're going to add a little bit more grey in as well to get the details of the pine trees. Okay, a little trick for you. Have you ever struggled with painting a vertical line, like for this tree for example? I do all the time. So if you can, flip your canvas horizontally. It's so much easier to draw or paint a straight line horizontally than it is vertically. So trust me, it works. It's such a good way of painting a straighter line. Okay, so now we're at the modelling stage. So at this point I've left the painting to dry for, I think it was 2 days, and now we are coming back and we're just starting to define areas again. We're going to redefine it all. We're going to go over the whole painting again. We're going to add more colour, and we're going to make areas darker, and we're going to start to make areas more lighter as well. And as you can see, I've just gone back and defined some of those far distant trees. They don't need to be too detailed at all because they are in the distance. And I've got my rigger brush out, and I've started to add in the finer little trees now, which are just behind the cabin. Now for painting these pine needles on these trees, I found a really old dagger brush, and it completely lost its shape. But that really helped in getting the random marks of all these pine needles, and I think it came out really well. And remember, we're not looking for detail at this stage, so we are literally just making marks, putting suggestions down of where these leaves are, so that when we go back later on we can redefine these areas with a little bit more of a pointed round brush probably, and just to get those last boughs at the end of these branches. Now, thanks to the magic of editing, you won't see how long it actually took me to put all these trees in and all these branches, but it was worth it. I think as a whole, at the end when you see the piece, that those little details are the ones that really matter and make the whole piece come alive, and really tell the story of what it was like being there for me and seeing all these trees, and all different types of trees as well. And as these trees aren't in the foreground, they are probably about the mid-ground, they are a lighter colour, so they are mainly burnt sienna. I feel like towards more the foreground area, that's when I start to use my darker browns. So that's what creates the depth. You start with the darker colours at the front, and then you fade the colours out as it goes towards the background. Now if you're looking for a really quick way of building up leaves on your painting, use a fan brush. Using the corner of a fan brush works so well at adding on those individual boughs and those leaves. It looks so effective from a distance. So the colours I use, because this is quite a dark area for me, I'm using mainly Verdinian Hue with French Ultramarine, a mix of those two, and then also for a little bit of a lighter colour for those distant trees, I am just using a bit of Permanent Green Light. As I said, this is the layer where we start redefining everything. So I'm going over these pine trees again, this time with a darker colour of Raw Umber and also Ultramarine Blue as well. And that's going to give me my shadow marks on these pine trees, and I'm using my Dagger Striper #2 brush from Princeton. Amazing brush, couldn't recommend that brush enough, so I will give a link down below if you want to have a look for that brush. Now carrying on with that brush, I am putting on the second layer of the cabin. This is my favourite part, because this is where you add those shadows and you start to add those highlights again, and it really starts to come alive. I just love the way that light starts to take over, and with that contrast to the shadow, it makes the light pop even more. And a little tip, when you're blending the light, always start from the top by your brightest area and then make your way down and then fade it into the dark. So yeah, we're just going over the whole cabin again, making the darks darker, the lights lighter, redefining everything, and then we're going to flip it around again because it's much easier to draw those straighter lines for those individual bits of wood on the cabin. Now I've grabbed my pointed round Series 2 brush now, and I'm just starting to indicate little bits of detail, little bits of pine boughs and moss fallen from the trees and landing on that roof, and we're just slowly starting to build that detail now, which is really exciting. I love this part. And can you see now how us going over the cabin again with those darker colours has really had an effect on that light, and it's really starting to glow now. And remember, in this light area by the porch, we still want to keep our shadows really light. So it's still just a mix of burnt sienna and a tiny bit now of raw umber. And we want to keep our lights much thicker than we do our shadows in this area. And that is really going to help this whole bit really pop in the end. And we're coming to the end now of that modelling phase, and I really think that cabin is really starting to take its shape, and it's really starting to glow now, which is what I really wanted. And when we get this the dark foreground bits in, I think that cabin is just going to really stand out. And now it is time for the last part, the detailing part. This is where it all starts to come alive, I think. Those final finishing touches. And as you can see, we've moved on to the bark on the pine trees. And this is just a mix of titanium white, raw umber and French ultramarine to make it look like a grey colour. And as we're at the detailing stage now, I'm using a lot more thicker paint on my brush. And that's only in the highlighted areas, because the shadows we're keeping soft. We've been keeping the shadows soft the whole time, but those highlights really stand proud when they're next to those soft shadows. And as you can see, I'm using thick cadmium yellow directly under that main light source for those individual blades of grass, and they're really standing out now. Now the detailing stage is very time consuming, but it's worth it. I love just zoning out in these areas and building up these tussocks of grass and these ferns, and just especially in the foreground area at the very bottom. You'll see a bit later on there's a couple of ferns I put in, and I love those little details because it's not obvious from a distance that they're there, and it's not till you get really close up that you really appreciate the little tiny details. And for these individual blades of grass what you see me putting in here, I'm using permanent green light with a little bit of liquid original, and the brush I'm using is a super fine rigger brush. Now I've been waiting for this stage to put this tree in. I could have put it in when I blocked the cabin, but I knew I was going to have to come back and give that cabin a second coat, so it made sense to wait to the end, and I'm really pleased with how it came out actually. And it looks like I used pure black there, but I actually used a mixture of raw umber and French ultramarine, and for my grey colour I just added a little bit of titanium white to that mixture. Now all the time we was at this cabin we were visited by this little muntjac deer every day, scavenging for some food, and there was a couple of them in the forest, but we seemed to have one that kept visiting us, and it was very cute, so I had to put a little tribute into him in there somewhere in the painting. So I didn't want him too bold, I just wanted him to like subtly be put in there somewhere for the viewer to find when they're looking up close. Now you need a super steady hand for this bit, unfortunately. I am starting to put in those individual bits of board on the cabin now with my superfine rigger brush. And so for the bit by the light, I'm using a lighter mixture for my darker colour, and that is raw sienna, and I'm going to use a little bit of liquid original with that. And the further away we get along that wall, away from the light, I'm using raw umber and French ultramarine blue. And we're just repeating that step again here on the back of the cabin with the light shadow colours under that light. Now as this porch area is the closest thing to the light source, that means we need to make it more lighter, so I'm using my cadmium yellow and I'm adding in titanium white to give me that lighter colour, and it'll really start to glow as soon as we put that on. And with that it's time to add those final bits of detail now, using my pure titanium white mixed in with liquid impasto, and that'll really stand out when you apply that, as the liquid impasto actually thickens the paint. I really hope you've enjoyed watching me bring this painting to life, and if you feel inspired to paint this piece, please feel free, just give me a little tag somewhere, find me on Instagram, and yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you can, leave me a like or a subscribe or a comment, it would mean the absolute world to me. This is my first time doing a video like this, so I really hope you've enjoyed it, and yeah, I'll leave you with the final shots of this painting. Thank you for watching, guys.